Dust devils danced across the parched earth of the San Simon Valley, Arizona Territory, 1881. Caleb Thorne, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, squinted against the relentless glare. He rode a chestnut mare named Betsy, her coat dulled by dust, along the dry creek bed that marked the western boundary of his ranch. The drought had been unforgiving. Weeks since any rain. The price of beef was low, and the buzzards were fat. He stopped Betsy, his gaze drawn to a sight that made his blood run cold. A steer, one of his, lay sprawled on its side, its throat brutally slashed. Vultures already circled overhead, impatient. Caleb dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. He knelt beside the dead animal, the metallic tang of blood thick in the air. This wasn't the work of wolves or mountain lions. This was deliberate, malice. He'd seen this before, years ago, before Martha. His jaw tightened. The memory of that Apache raid, the screams, the flames, Martha, it was a brand seared into his soul. He forced it down, the familiar anger a cold stone in his gut. He had to focus. Survival demanded it. He scanned the ground for tracks, his eyes trained to read the subtle language of the desert. Apache. Chiricahua, judging by the moccasin prints. They were getting bolder. Caleb remounted and rode on, his Winchester rifle resting across his lap. He'd been a widower for 5 years, running the ranch alone, and it was all he had left. The drought was bad enough. Now this. Hours later, the sun a molten eye sinking toward the horizon, he found him. Half hidden beneath a scrubby mesquite, a figure lay motionless. At first, Caleb thought it was another victim of the heat, but then he saw the shallow rise and fall of the chest. He approached cautiously, Betsy sidestepping nervously. It was an Apache. Young, no more than 20, a scout, judging by the remnants of his tattered clothing. He was badly wounded, a deep gash across his shoulder, caked with dried blood. Flies buzzed around the wound. His skin was cracked and peeling from dehydration. Caleb's first instinct was to ride on, leave him to die. He was Apache. They were the enemy. They had taken everything from him. He reined Betsy in, his hand instinctively tightening on the rifle. He stared down at the young man, his face contorted in pain, even in unconsciousness. He remembered Martha, her kindness, her belief in fairness. He remembered holding her hand as she died, whispering promises of vengeance he could never fully deliver on. He dismounted, slowly. He reached for his canteen, the leather hot against his calloused fingers. He knelt beside the scout, tilting his head back gently. The young man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Fear flickered in his dark eyes. He tried to pull away, but his strength was gone. Caleb held the canteen to his lips. "Water," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Drink." The scout hesitated, suspicion warring with desperate need. He licked his cracked lips, then drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. Caleb let him drink his fill, rationing the precious liquid carefully. When he was done, the scout looked up at Caleb, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He spoke a few words in Apache, a guttural sound Caleb didn't understand. "I don't speak your tongue," Caleb said. "What's your name?" The scout didn't answer. He closed his eyes, exhaustion claiming him once more. He watched him for a long moment. He should leave him, get back to the ranch, protect what was left. But he couldn't. He couldn't explain it even to himself. Maybe it was the ghost of Martha. Maybe it was the flicker of humanity he saw in those desperate eyes. He adjusted the scout's position, making him more comfortable in the meager shade. He left the canteen beside him. Then he mounted Betsy and rode away. The image of the wounded Apache burned into his mind. He didn't look back. He told himself it was over, a moment of weakness, a drop of water in a desert of hate. He was wrong. 3 days later, Caleb rode back to his ranch house. The smell hit him first, smoke and ash. Then he saw it. The house was a smoldering ruin. The roof had collapsed, the walls blackened and crumbling. His few possessions, everything Martha had left him, gone. He spurred Betsy forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He rode to the corral, empty. His cattle, his livelihood, vanished. Rage, raw and blinding, surged through him. This time it wasn't a memory. It was happening again. They were taking everything. He stood there amidst the ashes, the sun beating down on his head, feeling the familiar sting of loss. He knew who was responsible. The Chiricahua. He would make them pay. As he stood there, surveying the devastation, he saw riders approaching in the distance, a posse, led by Jedediah Pike, the wealthiest cattle baron in the valley, and Caleb's sworn enemy. Pike reined in his horse, a sneer twisting his lips. "Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Heard about your misfortune. Shame, terrible shame." "Apache," Caleb said, his voice tight. "They did this." Pike nodded slowly. "That's what we figured. Been getting bolder lately. Raiding, killing. Something needs to be done." He looked at Caleb, his eyes cold and calculating. "Some folks are saying you might have had something to do with this, Thorne. Heard you were seen giving water to an Apache scout a few days back. Seems mighty suspicious." Caleb's blood ran cold. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Pike raised an eyebrow. "The way I see it, you've been coddling those savages. Now look what's happened. You brought this down on all of us." The other men in the posse murmured in agreement, their faces hardened with suspicion. "I didn't do anything wrong," Caleb said, his voice shaking with anger. "I just gave a man some water." "A savage," Pike spat. "A killer. And now you've paid the price. We all have." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're riding out to hunt 'em down, Thorne. You can come with us. Prove you're not one of 'em." Caleb stared at Pike, his mind reeling. He knew Pike hated him, had tried to run him off his land for years. Was this his chance? To frame him? But he had no choice. He had to clear his name. He had to find the men who had destroyed his life. He nodded slowly. "I'll ride with you." Pike smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. "Good. Let's ride." As Caleb followed the posse out of the ruins of his ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding into a trap, and that the single act of mercy he had shown a wounded Apache was about to cost him everything. The dust swirled around Caleb's boots as he walked away, the setting sun painting long shadows across the valley floor. He needed a plan, and fast. Jedediah Pike wasn't a man to be trifled with. He had money, influence, and a whole crew of hired guns at his beck and call. Caleb had a worn-out Colt Peacemaker, a decent horse, and a stubborn streak as wide as the San Simon Valley. He reached the livery stable on the edge of town, the familiar scent of hay and horseflesh, a welcome change from the stale air of the saloon. He paid the stable hand a silver dollar to saddle up his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Comanche, and then spent a few minutes checking the saddle and cinches, making sure everything was secure. He trusted Comanche with his life, and that trust had been earned on many a long and lonely ride. As he mounted, he scanned the street. No sign of Pike or his men. But he knew they were out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. He urged Comanche into a slow walk, heading west, away from town, towards the rugged Chiricahua Mountains in the distance. He needed to think, and he needed to find a place where he could think without having to constantly look over his shoulder. He rode for several hours, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air cooled as the altitude increased, and the desert landscape began to transform into scrubby foothills. He found a small clearing near a dry creek bed, dismounted, and hobbled Comanche. He built a small fire, the flames crackling and casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. He ate a cold biscuit and a piece of jerky, chewing slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't outgun Pike, not with the odds stacked so heavily against him. He had to be smarter. He had to find a weakness, an angle. He remembered what Old Man Hemmings had said about Pike's ranch. He runs that spread like a king, but he's got more enemies than friends. Enemies. That was the key. Pike had made enemies. He was too greedy, too ruthless. He'd stepped on too many toes. Caleb needed to find those enemies, and he needed to convince them that working together was their only chance. It was a long shot, but it was the only play he had. He spent the night under the stars, wrapped in his bedroll, the vast expanse of the desert sky a silent witness to his troubled thoughts. He slept fitfully, dreaming of gunfights and dusty chases, of Pike's sneering face and the glint of steel in his eyes. He woke before dawn, the air crisp and cold. He doused the fire, saddled Comanche, and set off again, heading deeper into the mountains. He knew of a small ranch, nestled in a hidden valley, where a family named Johnson eked out a hard-scrabble existence.
They were good people, honest people, but Pike had been trying to run them off their land for years, claiming their water rights. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat intensifying. Caleb's throat was dry, and he was running low on water. He needed to reach the Johnson ranch soon. Around midday, he crested a ridge and saw the valley spread out before him, a green oasis in the harsh landscape. He urged Comanche down the steep slope, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He rode up to the ranch house, a small, weathered structure surrounded by a few outbuildings and a struggling garden. A woman with sun-weathered skin and tired eyes emerged from the house, a rifle held loosely in her hands. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary. "Name's Caleb Thorne," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm looking for the Johnsons." "I'm Martha Johnson," she said. "What do you want?" Caleb dismounted and walked towards her, slowly, deliberately. "I know about your troubles with Jedediah Pike," he said. "I think I can help." Martha Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Pike's got a lot of friends," she said, "and a lot of guns." "I know," he said, "but he's also got a lot of enemies. Maybe it's time those enemies started working together." He spent the next hour talking to Martha and her husband, Tom, laying out his plan, explaining the situation, and trying to convince them that they had nothing to lose. They were hesitant at first, understandably so. They'd been fighting Pike for years, and they'd seen what he was capable of. But Caleb was persuasive, and he painted a picture of a future where they could live in peace without having to constantly look over their shoulders. Finally, they agreed to help. They knew a few other ranchers who had been wronged by Pike, and they promised to reach out to them to see if they were willing to join the cause. Caleb spent the night at the Johnson Ranch, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. As he sat around the table with the Johnsons, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could pull this off. Maybe he could bring Jedediah Pike to justice. The next morning, he rode out again, heading towards another ranch, another potential ally. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, and that the odds were still stacked against him. But he also knew that he was doing the right thing.
He was fighting for justice, for the little guy, for the future of the San Simon Valley, and that was a fight worth fighting. He reached the next ranch, a sprawling operation run by a gruff old cattleman named Silas, late in the afternoon. Silas was initially hostile, suspicious of Caleb's motives. But after Caleb explained his plan, and after the Johnsons vouched for him, Silas began to soften. "Pike's been trying to squeeze me out for years," Silas growled, stroking his grizzled beard. "Claims my cattle are trespassing on his land. Says I owe him money. It's all a bunch of lies." "I know," Caleb said. "He's doing the same thing to everyone. But we can stop him. We can fight back." Silas thought for a moment. His eyes narrowed. "All right," he said finally. "I'm in. I've got some boys who are good with guns, and I'm not afraid to use them." With each new ally, Caleb's confidence grew. He was building an army, a small but determined force of ranchers and farmers who were tired of being bullied by Jedediah Pike. They were ready to stand up for themselves, to fight for their land, and to take back the San Simon Valley. But Caleb knew that Pike wouldn't sit idly by and let them organize. He would strike back, and he would strike hard. Caleb had to be ready. He had to anticipate Pike's moves, and he had to be prepared to defend himself and his allies. The stakes were rising. The game was getting dangerous. And Caleb Thorne was right in the middle of it. He was ready. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. He'd seen that look in Pike's eye before, a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied easily. "I'll ride out." He turned and walked toward the livery, the dry Arizona dust swirling around his worn boots. He needed to move fast. Pike wouldn't give him much of a head start. He'd likely be watching, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Inside the livery, the smell of hay and horse sweat hung heavy. He saddled his Appaloosa, Ghost, checking the cinch twice. Ghost shifted nervously, sensing Caleb's tension. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." He packed a bedroll, a canteen, and a rifle scabbard onto Ghost. He grabbed a handful of jerky from his saddlebag, chewing it slowly as he led Ghost out of the livery. The sun beat down relentlessly, even this early in the day.
He estimated he had maybe 5 hours of daylight left. He needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and San Simon before nightfall. He mounted Ghost and rode out of town at a steady pace, heading southwest. He kept to the less traveled trails, relying on his knowledge of the terrain to avoid being spotted. He knew Pike would be looking for him, and he knew Pike wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to catch him. The landscape was unforgiving. Scrub brush, cacti, and rocky hills stretched as far as the eye could see. The heat shimmered off the ground, making it difficult to see clearly. Caleb squinting, constantly scanning the horizon. He needed to find some water soon, for both himself and Ghost. The desert could kill a man faster than a bullet. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the heat intensified. Caleb's throat was parched, and his lips were cracked. He rationed his water carefully, taking small sips to make it last. Ghost was beginning to flag, his breathing heavy. They needed water, and soon. Around midday, Caleb spotted a cluster of cottonwood trees in the distance, a sure sign of water. He urged Ghost forward, his hopes rising. As they approached the trees, he could hear the faint sound of running water. He dismounted and led Ghost to a small stream, letting him drink his fill. He knelt down and cupped his hands, drinking deeply. The cool water was a welcome relief. While Ghost drank, Caleb surveyed the area. The stream was small, but it was enough to sustain them for a while. He noticed fresh tracks near the water's edge, cattle and horses. Someone else had been here recently. He couldn't afford to linger. He let Ghost rest for an hour, then saddled him up again. They continued their journey, following the stream for a few miles before veering off into the hills. He needed to find a place to camp for the night, a place where he could defend himself if Pike came looking. As dusk approached, Caleb found a small cave hidden behind a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter from the elements and a good vantage point. He built a small fire inside the cave, careful to keep the flames low. He ate some more jerky and drank the last of his water. He knew he needed to find another water source soon. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle and listening to the sounds of the desert.
The silence was broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote or the rustling of a lizard in the underbrush. He knew Pike was out there somewhere, and he knew he wouldn't give up easily. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every rustle, every shadow jolted him awake. He knew he couldn't let his guard down. Pike was a predator, and he was the prey. He was awakened before dawn by a sound that sent a chill down his spine, the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. He grabbed his rifle and peered out of the cave. In the dim light, he could see 3 riders silhouetted against the horizon. He didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. Pike. He retreated further into the cave, taking cover behind the large rock. He knew he was outnumbered, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. He had a few hours of darkness left, and he intended to use them to his advantage. Pike and his men dismounted and approached the cave cautiously. "Thorne," Pike's voice boomed through the air. "Come out with your hands up. It's over." Caleb didn't answer. He remained hidden, waiting for the right moment. "We know you're in there, Thorne," Pike continued. "Don't make us come in after you. It'll be a lot messier for everyone involved." Still, Caleb said nothing. He could hear Pike's men moving around outside the cave, trying to find a way in. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed to make a move, and he needed to make it soon. He took a deep breath and steadied his rifle. He waited until one of Pike's men got close enough to the cave entrance, then he sprang into action. He fired a shot, hitting the man in the shoulder. The man cried out and stumbled backward. Caleb emerged from the cave, firing another shot at Pike. The bullet whizzed past Pike's head, narrowly missing him. Pike swore and drew his own gun. A gunfight erupted. Bullets flew back and forth, echoing through the hills. Caleb used the rocks as cover, firing accurately and efficiently. He managed to wound another of Pike's men, but he knew he couldn't hold him off forever. He saw an opportunity to escape. While Pike and his remaining man were distracted, he sprinted toward Ghost, who was tethered nearby. He leapt onto the horse's back and spurred him forward, riding away from the cave as fast as he could.
Pike and his man fired after him, but Caleb was already out of range. He rode hard, pushing Ghost to his limits. He knew Pike would be right behind him, but he had to put as much distance as possible between them. The chase was on. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the desert. Caleb glanced back and saw Pike and his man gaining on him. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to find a way to lose them. He spotted a narrow canyon ahead.
It was a risky move, but it was his only chance. He urged Ghost into the canyon, hoping it would provide some cover. The canyon walls were steep and rocky, making it difficult to ride. Caleb guided Ghost carefully, avoiding the loose rocks and treacherous terrain. He could hear Pike and his man behind him, their horses' hooves pounding against the ground. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, he saw something that made his heart sink. A dead end. He was trapped. He dismounted and took cover behind a large boulder, knowing that Pike would be there any moment. This was it, the final showdown. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. He had a few bullets left, and he intended to make them count. Pike and his man rode into the canyon, their faces grim. They dismounted and approached Caleb cautiously, their guns drawn. "It's over, Thorne," Pike said, his voice cold and menacing. "There's nowhere left to run." Caleb stood up, his rifle leveled at Pike. "It ain't over till I say it is, Pike." Dust swirled around his worn boots as he watched the stagecoach disappear over the horizon, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his horse, and the grim task ahead. He adjusted the rifle scabbard on his saddle and swung himself up onto the horse. "All right, Bess," he murmured, patting her neck. "Let's see if we can't find this lost lamb before the wolves do." He followed the faint tracks, barely visible against the parched earth. Jedediah Pike wasn't the type to leave a clear trail, but Caleb knew the land and he knew the man. Pike was predictable in his unpredictability, if that made any sense. He'd head for water, and the closest water was Bear Creek Canyon, a narrow, treacherous cut in the mountains about 15 miles west. The sun beat down mercilessly. Caleb pulled his hat lower and wished he'd filled his canteen fuller. The air shimmered with heat, and the silence was broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic thud of Bess's hoofs. Time stretched, each mile feeling like 5. He rationed his water, taking small sips and letting it linger in his mouth. Around midday he spotted vultures circling in the distance. A knot tightened in his stomach. Vultures meant death, and out here, death usually meant trouble. He urged Bess into a faster pace, his hand resting on the rifle across his lap. As he drew closer, he saw it, a broken-down wagon, its wheels splintered and useless. A dead mule lay nearby, its body bloated and attracting flies. The vultures were feasting on something else, something smaller, hidden beneath the torn canvas tarp. Caleb dismounted, his senses on high alert. He scanned the surrounding area, looking for any sign of Pike, any sign of life. Nothing. Just the oppressive heat, the stench of death, and the ominous circling of the vultures. He approached the wagon cautiously, raising his rifle. He pulled back the canvas tarp, bracing himself for what he might find. It was a child, a girl, no older than 10. She was unconscious, her face pale and scratched, her clothes torn. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. Weak, but there. He felt the surge of anger, hot and immediate. Pike would leave a child to die in the desert? He swore under his breath. He had underestimated the man's depravity. He gently lifted the girl into his arms and carried her to Bess. He fashioned a makeshift saddle for her, padding it with his bedroll. He tied her securely, making sure she wouldn't fall. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to get her to safety, to water. He mounted Bess, holding the girl close. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "We've got a long ride ahead." They moved slowly, the heat and the girl's weight taking their toll on Bess. Caleb kept a sharp eye on the horizon, wary of Pike, wary of trouble. He knew Pike wouldn't be far. He wouldn't abandon his prize without a fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, they reached Bear Creek Canyon. The air was cooler here, and the sound of running water was a welcome relief. Caleb dismounted, carefully lifting the girl from Bess's back. He carried her to the creek and gently bathed her face with cool water. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Caleb, confusion and fear clouding her gaze. "Mama?" she whispered. "I'm not your mama," Caleb said softly. "My name is Caleb. You're safe now." She looked around, her eyes widening as she took in her surroundings. "Where's Mama? Where's Papa?" Caleb hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but he couldn't lie. They're gone, little one. But you're not alone. I'm here." Tears welled in her eyes. "He took them," she sobbed. "The bad man took them." "Pike," Caleb said, his voice hard. "Jedediah Pike." The girl nodded, her body trembling. "He said he was taking us to a better place, but he lied." Caleb held her close, letting her cry. He knew he had to find Pike, not just for the girl, but for all the others he had wronged. He had to stop him, once and for all. He made a small fire, careful to keep it hidden from view. He heated some water and made a thin broth, feeding it to the girl slowly. She ate a few spoonfuls, then fell back asleep, exhausted. Caleb sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. He knew Pike was out there, watching, waiting. He could feel his presence like a cold wind on his skin. He thought about the girl, about her parents, about all the innocent lives Pike had destroyed. He thought about justice, about what was right and wrong, and he knew what he had to do. He waited. The night deepened, the stars blazing in the clear desert sky. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then he heard it, a twig snapping in the distance. He tensed, his hand tightening on his rifle. He knew Pike was close. He stood up, slowly and deliberately, and walked away from the fire, into the darkness. "I know you're out there, Pike," he called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Come out and face me." Silence. Then a voice, low and gravelly, answered him. "Thorne, I figured you'd come sniffing around." Pike stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. He held a rifle in his hand, pointed directly at Caleb. "Let the girl go, Pike," Caleb said. "It's over." "Over. It's just beginning, Thorne. You always were a fool, thinking you could stop me." "I'm not afraid of you, Pike." "You should be. I've got nothing left to lose." "Neither do I," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. The two men stood facing each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The only sound was the wind whistling through the canyon. Then Pike fired. Caleb reacted instantly, diving for cover behind a large rock. The bullet whizzed past his head, kicking up dust. He returned fire, aiming for Pike's chest. The bullet found its mark. Pike staggered backward, clutching his chest. He fired again, wildly, the bullet hitting the rock beside Caleb. Caleb emerged from behind the rock, his rifle still trained on Pike. "It's over, Pike," he said again. "Drop your weapon." Pike looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with hate. He raised his rifle again, but his hand was shaking. He knew he was beaten. He let the rifle fall to the ground. He looked at Caleb one last time, then turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb watched him go, his rifle still raised. He knew he should follow him, finish it, but he couldn't. Not now. The girl needed him. He lowered his rifle and turned back towards the fire, towards the sleeping girl. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He knew Pike would be back. He knew he would have to be ready. But for now, he had a little girl to protect, and that was all that mattered. Dust clinging to the sweat on his brow, he spurred the roan onward. It was another 10 miles, maybe 12, to the Cutter Ranch. He had to warn them. The sun beat down mercilessly. The roan, a sturdy animal, was already lathered. Caleb pulled up beside a scraggly mesquite, offering the horse a brief respite in its thin shade. He uncapped his canteen, offering the horse a trickle, before taking a long swallow himself. The water was warm, almost brackish, but it was wet. He scanned the horizon. Empty. Just shimmering heat haze and the endless expanse of the valley floor. He thought of Sarah Cutter, her kind eyes and gentle smile. He'd helped her mend a fence line just last month. Jedediah Pike wouldn't hesitate to hurt her or her family. The man was pure venom, coiled and ready to strike. Caleb remounted, urging the roan into a trot. He needed to push, but he couldn't afford to run the horse into the ground. Not yet. He kept a wary eye on the back trail, half expecting to see Pike and his men cresting the ridge. The hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher, then slowly began its descent. The air grew thick and heavy.
Caleb's throat was parched, his lips cracked. He rationed the remaining water, each sip a precious commodity. Finally, in the distance, he saw it, a cluster of cottonwoods marking the location of the Cutter Ranch. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by a renewed sense of urgency. He kicked the roan into a gallop, the horse responding with surprising vigor. He burst into the ranch yard, dust swirling around him. A young boy, no older than 10, stared at him wide-eyed from the porch. "Where's your pa?" Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse. The boy pointed towards the barn. "He's fixin' the wagon wheel." Caleb dismounted, leaving the roan ground-tied. He strode towards the barn, the urgency pounding in his chest. He found Jeb Cutter wrestling with a broken spoke. "Jeb, we got trouble." Cutter looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag. "Caleb, what brings you out this way?" "It's Pike. He's coming. He's got a posse with him. Said something about you rustling his cattle." Cutter's face hardened. "That's a damn lie. I ain't touched none of his stock." "I know that, Jeb, but he ain't interested in the truth. He's after your land. He told me as much." Cutter threw the spoke down in disgust. "That son of a bitch. I knew he was eyeing this place." He glanced towards the house. "Sarah, get the rifle." Sarah emerged from the house, her face pale but determined, carrying a Winchester. The young boy, his earlier fear replaced with a grim determination, hauled buckets of water from the well. Cutter gathered his hunting rifles and ammunition. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, they were as ready as they could be. They waited in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife.
"Pa?" the boy whispered, clutching his mother's hand. "Are they gonna hurt us?" "We won't let them, son," Cutter said, his voice firm. "We'll fight them off." Caleb stood by the window, rifle in hand, peering into the darkness. He could hear the distant sound of horses, growing louder with each passing minute. "They're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. A moment later, they appeared, a dark mass of riders silhouetted against the fading light. Pike was in the lead, his face a mask of grim determination. "Cutter!" Pike shouted, his voice echoing across the valley. "Come out peaceably, and maybe we'll go easy on you." Cutter stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held at his side. "You're trespassing, Pike. Get off my land." "This ain't your land anymore, Cutter. You're a rustler and a thief. We're here to bring you to justice." "You're a liar, Pike. You just want my land." "That's enough talk," Pike said. "Take him." The riders surged forward, their horses thundering across the open ground. Cutter raised his rifle and fired. A rider screamed and fell from his horse. The battle had begun. Caleb fired from the window, picking off another rider. Sarah reloaded rifles, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The boy huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. The attackers swarmed around the house, firing blindly through the windows. Bullets ripped through the walls, sending splinters of wood flying. Caleb felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. He'd been hit. He ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. He had to protect the Cutters. He had to stop Pike. The fight raged on through the night. The Cutters, outnumbered but determined, held their ground. They repelled wave after wave of attackers, their rifles spitting fire in the darkness. As dawn began to break, the tide began to turn. Pike's men, exhausted and demoralized, started to lose their nerve. Several had been wounded, and 2 lay dead in the yard. Pike, realizing he was losing, rallied his remaining men for one final assault. He charged towards the house, firing his pistol. Caleb saw him coming. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. Pike staggered, clutching his chest. He fell to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief. With their leader down, Pike's men broke and ran.
They scrambled onto their horses and fled into the darkness, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The battle was over. Caleb slumped against the wall, his shoulder throbbing. He was alive. The Cutters were alive. They had survived. He looked out at the rising sun, casting its golden light across the valley. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder, but there was also a sense of peace. He knew that Pike's defeat wouldn't be the end of their troubles. There would be others who would try to take their land, but for now they were safe. They had defended their home, and they had won. Jeb walked over to Caleb and put a hand on his good shoulder. "Thank you, Caleb. You saved our lives." Caleb managed a weak smile. "You'd have done the same for me, Jeb." Sarah came over and took Caleb's hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We'll never forget what you did for us." The boy, his fear now replaced with awe, looked up at Caleb. "You're a hero, mister." Caleb looked at the boy, then at the rising sun. He knew he was no hero. He was just a man trying to do what was right. But in that moment, standing in the middle of the San Simon Valley, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had stood up to evil, and he had prevailed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Dust and dirt. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. The sun beat down on Caleb's neck, turning the dust on his skin to a gritty paste. He glanced at the water skin hanging from his saddle horn. Half full, maybe. Enough to get him to the next seep, but not enough for a protracted chase. Pike, he knew, wouldn't be burdened by such concerns. Pike had men, horses, and access to supplies. Caleb had grit, a rifle, and a growing sense of desperation. He urged his horse into a shallow arroyo. The shade offered a momentary respite from the relentless heat. He dismounted, loosening the cinch and letting Dusty graze on the sparse, wiry grass. He pulled out his map, a tattered thing he'd acquired in Tombstone some years ago. He spread it on a flat rock, tracing the faint lines that represented the network of trails crisscrossing the San Simon Valley. Pike was heading east towards the Chiricahua Mountains.
That meant he was likely aiming for the old Apache Pass, a known smuggling route into Mexico. His jaw tightened.
Pike wasn't just running. He was planning something big. He considered his options. He could try to intercept Pike at the pass, but that would be a fool's errand. Pike would be expecting him, and he'd be heavily outnumbered. No, he needed to be smarter. He needed to find a way to disrupt Pike's plans, to cut him off at the knees before he could solidify his position. He studied the map again, his eyes scanning the contours of the land. There was a small settlement, barely a speck on the map, called Dos Cabezas, about a day's ride south of the pass. It was a crossroads of sorts, a place where travelers often stopped to resupply. If Pike was planning on using the pass, he'd likely need to pass through Dos Cabezas. It was a long shot, but it was the best he had. He rolled up the map, tightened Dusty's cinch, and swung back into the saddle. He took one last look at the direction Pike had taken, then turned Dusty south. The sun was already beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor. He had a lot of ground to cover before nightfall. The ride to Dos Cabezas was grueling. The sun seemed to mock him, baking the earth and turning the air thick and heavy. Dusty plodded on, his hooves kicking up clouds of dust that coated Caleb from head to toe. He rationed his water carefully, taking small sips to moisten his parched throat. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and the desert came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Coyotes howled in the distance, their mournful cries echoing through the canyons. Caleb kept his rifle close, his senses on high alert. He wasn't alone out here, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He finally reached Dos Cabezas just before dawn. The settlement consisted of a handful of ramshackle buildings clustered around a dusty square. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a few scattered adobe houses. It was a desolate place, but it was a place nonetheless. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the swinging doors creaking open with a mournful groan. The air inside was thick with stale beer and tobacco smoke. A few rough-looking men were huddled around a poker table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache and a weary expression, looked up as Caleb entered.
"What'll it be, stranger?" "Whiskey," Caleb said, his voice hoarse, "and some information." The bartender poured him a shot of whiskey, then leaned closer. "Information costs extra." Caleb tossed a silver dollar onto the counter. "I'm looking for a man named Jedediah Pike. Have you seen him?" The bartender's eyes narrowed. "Pike? What's your business with him?" "That's my business," Caleb said, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Have you seen him or not?" The bartender hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He came through here yesterday, headed east." Caleb felt a surge of adrenaline. He was on the right track. "Did he say where he was going?" "Said he was going to do some business in Mexico," the bartender replied. "Had a few men with him. Mean-looking bunch." "Did he buy any supplies here?" "Bought a lot of everything," the bartender said. "Food, water, ammunition, enough to outfit a small army." Caleb slammed his fist on the counter. This was worse than he thought. Pike wasn't just running, he was preparing for something big, something that would likely bring a lot of trouble to the San Simon Valley. He finished his whiskey and turned to leave. "Thanks for the information." "Be careful out there, stranger," the bartender said. "Pike's not a man to be trifled with." Caleb nodded grimly and stepped back out into the dusty street. He needed to stop Pike, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He walked over to the general store, hoping to find someone who might be willing to lend a hand. The storekeeper, a wizened old man with a squinty gaze, was stacking cans of beans on a shelf. "Morning," Caleb said. "I'm looking for a few good men, Men who aren't afraid of a fight." The storekeeper stopped stacking cans and looked at Caleb with suspicion. "What kind of fight are you talking about?" "The kind that's coming to this valley," Caleb said. "Jedediah Pike is planning something, and it's not going to be good for anyone here." The storekeeper sighed. "Pike, that name rings a bell. He bought a lot of goods here, too, flashing a roll of greenbacks that'd choke a horse. He's heading to the Apache Pass, likely to link up with some unsavory characters on the other side," Caleb said. "I need help stopping him." The storekeeper shook his head. "I'm just a storekeeper, son. I don't get involved in that kind of thing."
"This isn't just about me," Caleb said. "This is about protecting your home, your livelihood. Pike's gonna bring trouble to this valley, and if we don't stop him, it'll be too late." The storekeeper hesitated for a moment and looked around the empty store. "I might know a couple of fellas who'd be interested," he said. "They ain't much, but they're loyal. Go talk to Hank over at the blacksmith shop. He owes me a favor or two." Caleb felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He thanked the storekeeper and headed towards the blacksmith shop. The clang of metal on metal echoed through the air as he approached. A large, muscular man with a soot-stained face was hammering a horseshoe on an anvil. "Hank?" Caleb asked. The blacksmith stopped hammering and looked up. "That's me. What do you want?" Caleb explained the situation, telling Hank about Pike's plans and the need to stop him. Hank listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Pike, huh?" Hank said. "I've heard stories about that son of a bitch. He's bad news." "I need your help, Hank. I can't do this alone." Hank wiped the sweat from his brow with a dirty rag. "I ain't much of a gunslinger, but I know my way around a hammer, and I owe old man Johnson a favor or two. Count me in." Caleb felt a surge of relief. He had one man on his side. Now he just needed to find one more. "There's one other man the storekeeper mentioned. He's supposed to be loyal, but that's all I know." "That'd be old Jebediah. Spends most days at the saloon, nursing a beer and telling tall tales nobody believes. He's got a good heart, though, and a rifle. Let's go talk to him." With Hank at his side, Caleb felt a little less alone. The odds were still stacked against them, but they had a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. They headed back towards the saloon, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The fate of the San Simon Valley might very well depend on it. Caleb spat a stream of dust-colored saliva. "That's Pike's doing, ain't it?" The old-timer, his face a road map of wrinkles, nodded slowly. "Pike and his boys. Been bleeding the valley dry for nigh on 2 years now. Claiming water rights, charging exorbitant rates. Folks can't afford it. Their land dries up. He buys it for pennies on the dollar." Caleb felt a cold anger settle in his gut. He'd heard whispers of Pike, of course. Everyone had. But seeing the reality, the parched earth and the defeated look in the old-timer's eyes, was something else entirely. "He won't get away with it," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. The old-timer chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Easier said than done, son. Pike's got the law in his pocket and enough guns to make a preacher pray for forgiveness." Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to say what he intended. His actions would speak for him. He thanked the old-timer for the information, offered him a canteen of water, and remounted his horse. He pointed the animal toward the south, in the direction of Pike's ranch. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the valley into a shimmering furnace. Caleb rode for hours, the only sound the rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves and the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. The land grew increasingly barren, the sparse vegetation choked with dust. He rationed his water carefully, knowing the next source was likely miles away and likely controlled by Pike. As dusk approached, a cluster of buildings appeared on the horizon, nestled against a rocky outcrop. A windmill creaked lazily in the dying breeze. This was it. Pike's spread. Caleb slowed his horse, his senses on high alert. He scanned the buildings, a large ranch house, a bunkhouse, a barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A corral held a dozen or so horses, looking sleek and well-fed, a stark contrast to the scrawny livestock he'd seen earlier. He dismounted a good distance away and tied his horse to a scrubby mesquite. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checked the load, and started walking, keeping to the shadows. He circled the perimeter, observing the layout. 2 men sat on the porch of the ranch house, rifles across their laps. Another patrolled the corral, his movements casual but alert. Pike was taking no chances. Caleb needed a plan. He couldn't just ride in guns blazing. He'd be outnumbered and outgunned. He needed to find a weakness, an opening. He spotted it near the barn. A water tank, elevated on a wooden platform, fed a trough for the livestock. A single pipe led from the tank, presumably supplying water to the ranch house and other buildings. If he could disable the water supply, even temporarily, it would create chaos and buy him some time.
He crept closer to the barn, using the shadows to his advantage. The guard in the corral was his immediate problem. Caleb waited patiently, watching the man's movements. He seemed bored, his attention wandering. Finally, the guard turned his back, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. It was Caleb's chance. He moved swiftly and silently, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. He brought the butt of his rifle down on the guard's head. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Caleb dragged the unconscious guard into the shadows of the barn and then turned his attention to the water tank. The pipe was thick and made of iron, but he had a plan. He pulled a small, wickedly sharp file from his saddlebag, a tool he usually used for sharpening his knives. It would take time, but he could weaken the pipe enough to cause a leak, maybe even a break. He set to work, the file rasping against the metal. The sound was faint, but he was acutely aware of the risk of being discovered. He paused frequently, listening for any sign of alarm. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. The air cooled slightly, but the heat still radiated from the ground. Caleb's shirt was soaked with sweat. His muscles ached, but he continued to work, his determination fueled by the injustice he'd witnessed. After what felt like an eternity, he felt the metal give way. A hairline crack appeared on the pipe. He filed a little more, and then a little more. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the pipe split open. Water gushed out, soaking the ground. He'd done it. Now to see what chaos ensued. He retreated to the shadows of the barn and waited. It didn't take long. A shout rang out from the ranch house. "Water's gone! What the hell's going on?" The 2 men on the porch jumped to their feet, their rifles at ready. They ran towards the barn, yelling for the guard. Caleb melted back into the darkness, moving around the back of the barn. He needed to get a better vantage point. He circled around to the side of the ranch house, keeping low to the ground. He could hear the 2 men cursing as they examined the broken pipe. "Sabotage! That's what it is!" one of them yelled. "Pike's gonna skin someone alive for this!" Caleb saw his chance. While they were distracted, he could slip into the ranch house and find Pike. He didn't expect a warm welcome. He crept to the back of the house, trying the back door. Locked. He moved to a window, peering inside. The room was dark, but he could make out the shapes of furniture. He tried the window. It was unlocked. He slid it open silently and slipped inside. He found himself in a small pantry, stocked with canned goods and supplies. He moved cautiously into the main room of the house. It was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on a table. Pike sat at the table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He was a large man, with a thick neck and a cruel, weathered face. He looked up as Caleb entered, his eyes narrowing. "Well, well," Pike said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Looks like we have a visitor." He reached for the pistol on the table. Caleb raised his rifle. "Don't move, Pike." Pike froze, his hand hovering over the pistol. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Caleb Thorne. I'm here to put an end to your little empire." Pike laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "You and what army?" "Just me," Caleb said. "But that's all it takes." Pike stared at him for a long moment, assessing him. He saw the determination in Caleb's eyes, the cold steel in his gaze. He knew this wasn't just some drifter looking for trouble. This was a man who meant business. "You're making a mistake, Thorne," Pike said, his voice suddenly calm. "You can't win. I have too much power, too many friends." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but I'm not afraid to die trying." He leveled his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Now tell me, how much water is left in the valley?"